One-person privilege. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we continue to commemorate Black History Month, I thought I'd take a little different tact this time based on a conversation that I had with a prominent elected official from the other side of the aisle who one night over dinner asked me, how are we doing with race relations in Virginia? Which was quite an interesting dinner topic of conversation. And the more we talked, the more I came to the conclusion that obviously we've come a long way, but the biggest problem I think that faces us now is with more and more people born after Jim Crow who don't fully know or appreciate the impacts that Jim Crow and the legacy of slavery still have today. We've seen this played out many times when pieces of legislation that look on its face like good public policy, when we start to peel back the layers and fully understand our history, we can see how it would have a disproportionate impact on one segment of Virginia. And so today, rather than focusing on an individual or a moment in time, I want to talk about an act of this body. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 consisted of two pieces of legislation. One we've officially expressed regret for and heard about on this floor was the Sterilization Act. I'm not going to focus on that piece. But I am going to focus on the Racial Integrity Act, which was Senate Bill 219. And these two acts instituted the eugenics movement in Virginia. What the Racial Integrity Act did is it required for the first time, when births were recorded, that individuals would be classified as either white or colored. That was it. It also outlawed interracial marriage by criminalizing all marriages between white and non-white persons. That portion of the act was invalidated by the Supreme Court's Loving versus Virginia case, which we heard about last year when we celebrated the 50th anniversary. But the rest of the act remained in place. And what you may not know was that the first director of the Department of Vital Statistics was a gentleman named Walter Plecker, who was a white supremacist, it was his domain to implement the birth recording portion of the act, and implement it he did. If an individual did not check, if they were not white, and they did not check the colored box on the form, they were not given a birth certificate. This caused problems for two groups of people: mixed race Virginians who would refuse to check the color box because they felt, well, I'm both. But more importantly, it impacted the members of the Virginia tribes. Dr. Plecker was convinced there was no such thing as a true, pure-blood Virginia Indian. He went so far as to send a letter. Well, here's what he had to say about Virginia's Indians. He said the tribes had become a mongrel mixture of black and American Indian blood. Their very existence greatly disturbed him, as did mulatto children, which were mixed black and white. He was convinced the mulatto offspring would slowly seep into the white race like rats when you're not watching. They've been slowly sneaking in their birth certificates through their own midwives, giving either Indian or white racial classification. He called them a breach in the dike that had to be stopped. So he would do a couple of things. He went so far as to write local registrars with a list of surnames. And I won't read the letter because it's too offensive. But he basically said that it has come to his attention that many of these mongrels were trying to pass themselves off as white. And if you saw anyone with this surname, they were not white, they were colored, you would treat them as such. He even went so far as to go to our schools and say, you will not allow any children with these surnames in because they are not white. He even went as far as to, he did some other pretty bad things. But the point was, and he even admitted, half of this stuff he made up. But he was so convinced that he was right, and he had the power to institute his narrow view of what this Commonwealth should look like, that he left two legacies. He was the director of vital statistics until he retired in 1946. And there were a number of people born as late as 1946 who did not receive a birth certificate because they did not check a box the way he wanted them to. There were two legacies. Some you've heard me talk about on this floor. To get a government-issued photo ID in this post-9/11 world, you need a birth certificate. One of Dr. Plecker's legacies is we have people born in Virginia who do not. Even more pernicious, you have heard on this House floor the struggles that our native tribes have had to be recognized by the federal government. That is because, with the stroke of a pen, Dr. Plecker erased many of those individuals' tribal heritage. They could not prove a direct line of Indian heritage because one man, with the stroke of a pen, wiped out every bit of Native American blood they had and classified them as black. To this day, those 8 tribes struggle to be recognized. And so I say, when we are debating complicated issues on the floor, sometimes we need to step back and not just look at it on its face and say, how will this affect people born today? Because even though the Racial Integrity Act was finally repealed in 1975, its legacies still live today. We need to think about that with every piece of legislation we put forward in this body. Not just how will it impact us in our next election, not just will it on its face solve a problem we think needs to be solved, but how will this affect Virginians, all Virginians, for years to come? And I thank you for your attention this morning.